Unit 11 is about feedback, and I want to just sort of briefly touch on this. It's more important than my brief touching would lead you to believe. But the point is that if you think in terms of goals, and you think in terms of learning goals as outcomes, and what kind of change do you want people to experience, right? How are they going to be different? What are they going to learn means what change or transformation will have happened. And you start this whole process of mapping out what a learning experience, whether that's a day, whether that's a class, whether that's an hour, whether that's a course, whether that's a degree, whether that's a discipleship program for a church, whatever. Start with goals, right? Next step in this is really think about assessment. Think about, well, if we want people to be changed and transformed like this, how will we know if it has happened? What would it look like? What would be indicators of that actually happening? What kind of growth? Measured in what way? Recognizable in what way? Pointed out in what way? Right? That's what this is really all about. That feeds into the idea of feedback, right? So that if you have a mapped out path that this is what this would look like, you're able to say to people, well, you're doing really well on these things, but not so well on these things yet. We need to keep working towards these things, right? People do not learn everything there is to learn, especially in a complex system with multiple goals all at the same rate, right? There might be some goals that are easier for people and other goals that are harder for people, right? So the idea here is if you really name how are you going to know whether people are learning, you're able to actually give lots of good feedback along the way in terms of how are you doing. One of the points we made about adult education is that adults do really well when they know where they are in the journey and how they're getting feedback along the way. What's going well, what hasn't reached the standard yet. Right? The great thing about adult education, as much as possible, is to get it out of the sense of grading and marking and evaluating and into the how are we doing on this journey towards the goals that we actually have set together, right? How can we work together to get all the way to the end of the road, right? That's far better than saying, well, you get a bad mark on that, right? Which gets you into this whole guilt and shame thing and this anxiety producing and all the results that other people are measuring, right? As much as possible, I think, get away from that, right? Especially, I'm just thinking of a church context where you don't want people to feel like they're getting a C or whatever, a failing mark on their spiritual life. That tends to be very discouraging. So filtering all of this, through a kind of formal educational competitive ranking and marking sort of system is not really conducive to opening up people really to growing. So let's not do that. A couple of things on this outline I just wanted to point out, which is the difference between formative and summative assessment, to use technical language. Look at page 79. C, D, and E become really important. Helping people understand where they are, in a sense, even before they begin or as they begin, called here diagnostic assessment. Right? Where are you now with regard to this issue? Let's just keep my baking of a cake before us, right? What's your previous knowledge, skill, experience, confidence with regard to all of that? Where are you bringing to this? Where are you? Have you ever baked a cake before? Right? Formative assessment is right during the learning process, the process of feedback about how you're doing with that cake to help you do better at it, right? And this is the idea that, in baking of a cake, it's a great example because someone would come along and say, no, you need to stir that differently. No, that's not mixed enough, right? No, that's not when you put that ingredient in. Right? So that is formative assessment. In other words, it's forming you as you go in learning how to do the thing. Right? So it's feedback that's ongoing along the way to help you do the thing as best you possibly can. Okay? And so, some of the examples here is, the kind of papers that you do, the work that you do. This is the stirring and the making of your sample cake. In my example. Summative assessment is really summing up at the end, evaluatively, how did it go in the end? And the people that I know that have actually done chef training know that there's super high standards, and you actually could get a very bad mark on your cake. You might think it's great, but no, not good enough. The air bubbles were too big. You're like, oh my gosh, the air bubbles. Right? So there is a sense in which this is where the summative assessment is, at the end of the semester, there is a test, right? There is an exam at some point. It tends to be more formalized, and it's to say at the end, were you able to accomplish all the things? As opposed to the more formative, which is along the way, the feedback that helps you how to do it, right? Very important distinctions and really, really good. And unfortunately, I'd say this sort of self-critically in a way, unfortunately higher education has really done a lot with the summative and not a lot with the formative, although the formative is really where learning happens. Okay, formative is really important to learning. The feedback as to how you're doing, right? So you could try on your own, unaccompanied, to do a better cake, and then just get whatever mark you get on your cake at the end of the day. But learning is going to happen by the feedback that says, oh no, stir it faster. Oh no, add this ingredient then. Oh no, here's the little secret, right? That's the formative, right? So, feedback is going to be really important. So I've given you a bunch of materials here about different kinds of feedback. A couple of things I just wanted to say before we go on is timeliness and specificity of feedback is the really important thing. Okay? So it's to how you're doing with this particular task that you get timely and relevant and accurate feedback about it. That's the key thing. In other words, there is the teachable moment, and it's your baking of the cake that matters, not your neighbor's. And it's not the class average on how the cake is doing that matters. It's whether you're improving what you're doing with timely, focused, specific kinds of feedback, timely being important. For those of us in formal educational systems, this is the way to think about students doing assignments, which is that you actually want to produce a system where it's not just the mark you get on something that's useful, but that it's giving feedback that's helping people to learn. Right? So the whole thing about feedback, assessment, and eventually the more formal grading, if you have to do grading, some of us do have to do grading, is how does that actually conducive to learning? Okay? So this course is trying to put the great thing of learning with a capital L in the center of the conversation, and I'm driving towards, well, how does this, and this of our facets all make for maximal learning? My question here is, how does feedback make for maximal learning? How does even the thing of formal education and its requirements of tests and exams and papers and projects and all of that other sort of stuff. Those of you who are no longer doing this are probably thinking, wow, aren't I glad I'm not doing that anymore. That was burdensome and stressful and anxiety producing and all that. But usually what it has been sort of in a sense reduced to in a lot of higher education is not looking at those things as feeding back into learning, but simply at the end of the day to say whether learning happened and how it happened. What I'm interested in is feeding back into the learning process, right? So in marking a paper, for instance, in my field in theology and ethics, people write a lot of papers. That's part of the discipline. It's giving people timely feedback about how they did it and how they do it better next time, not just how well they did it. How do you make it an educational project? How do people learn from it, right? And feedback is going to be very, very important to that. People tend to be, I think, respond well when they have a sense that they're being taken seriously and that the goal of the project is for them to learn, not just to jump over a hoop, not just to get through some standard, not just to tick a box, right? In things like church contexts, I think if you're really intentionally working with a group of people towards some goal, some learning and growth kind of goal, for people to get feedback along the way is encouraging, even if the feedback is, well, we're not there yet. Right? But someone's caring about you, someone's individualizing timely, appropriate, suitable feedback to you, taking you seriously, caring for you to move forward along those ways. How does assessment and feedback feed into learning? That's the point. Okay? One of the problems with a lot of higher education, and something that I still struggle with, is when you put all of that to the very end of the course or the end of the degree program, there's no way to give any feedback back that really is timely enough because the thing is over. Right? So it's like, oh, I wish I'd known that sooner, right? So I do some structuring of things to give more feedback sooner so people know how they're doing and not waiting all the way to the end. Right? Very interesting problem. On page, where am I up to, 85, and a few other pages thereafter, I've given the example of classroom assessment techniques, which is just a way to do a very, very quick and simple way of trying to get a handle on how do you know what your students have learned and what are they taking away. So a little example would be if I paused right now in this class and said, okay, what's the most important thing that you're going to take away from today's class? Right? If you have 3 minutes to think about it and a little card, do you have 3x5 cards here? You know what I mean? Those little sort of index cards? Yeah. If you just had one little card to write down that one thing that you are going to take away with, what would it be? Right? Then you'd give that to me at the end of the day. Right? I'd look at that and say, oh, most of the class was talking about this as the most important thing that struck them as the most important thing they were going to take away. I would then know that, and I would come back into the next class, assuming we had another class, which we don't, but assuming we did in my scenario, I would then be able to come back and say, now wasn't it interesting that like 2/3 of you thought this was the main thing that you were taking away, that you found valuable for your own future? Let's talk about that. Why was that the way it was? What else could we expand on that, deal with that, right? So that's a classroom assessment technique. There's lots in this list here. It's a way of understanding, getting people to do two things. Reflect, right? Reflect themselves, process, apply, and also give me as the teacher feedback about what are you learning, right? What's relevant and valuable for you that I should know about, right? So I'm assuming this is not a one-way street, all going one direction. I'm actually going to take what you're learning seriously and say, oh, now let's actually adjust the program here a little bit, even if it's for 5 minutes, maybe it's for 5 hours, in light of what people are actually feeding back, in light of what people are actually learning. Right? So it's more the we're in this game together to actually accomplish something together. So I need to know what you're learning and how you're processing it, just as much as you need to have some tracking with me and my role in shaping and molding and taking us in a particular direction. See? There's a whole bunch of little things here. They tend to be short exercises with reflection, feedback, into a kind of feedback loop, right? That makes some sense, right? So I'll give you some of those. Grading, there's some stuff here on grading. I'm pretty critical about grading because of the bias that I have that I've just been talking to you about, which is I'm all for learning, and I want to know how does that process help learning? Does it really help learning, or does it only measure learning after learning has happened? That's valid. That's important. Don't misunderstand me. People have to pass exams and grades and degrees. I understand it. I'm not trying to rule them all out. I'm just trying to say they don't always help actually learning, and I'm after learning.